Having covered focusing, aperture and depth of field, we can now bring it all together and tackle hyperfocal distance. So hyperfocal distance is a technique for maximizing the sharpness range within an image. And it's a way of intelligently maximizing depth of field. So let's just recall what depth of field is. So a normal lens can only focus on one particular distance, unlike tilt and shift lenses, which can be changed to focus at different distances. So this is called the plane of focus, that one particular distance that the lens is focused on. To each side of this plane of focus is an area we consider acceptably sharp, and we call that the depth of field. Just remember that depth of field is subjective. What looks sharp to some isn't to others, and it depends on the output that you're going to have. If you're going to have a very small picture, then depth of field can look greater than if you're producing a huge print where people can examine it closer. So controlling depth of field, we can do that through focal length. So wider angle lenses have greater depth of field than telephoto lenses. And that's for any particular aperture, f8, f11, when you relate it to each lens. We can do it through aperture. So smaller apertures with a larger numbers, like f16, f22, increases depth of field. Larger apertures, like f2.8, f1.4, decreases depth of field. And if you can recall back to those cones of light that I was talking about, that's useful to remember when we're talking about depth of field. Smaller camera sensors, they increase the apparent depth of field because the sensors are so small that those cones of light don't attack the sensor at such a greater angle as you do with larger sensors. And depth of field extends 2/3 of the way from the plane of focus and only 1/3 of the way towards the camera. Okay, depending on where you focus the lens. So hyperfocal distance is a way of intelligently using these effects that we've just been talking about. So determining hyperfocal distance, how do we do it? So when the lens is focused on infinity, okay, infinity, or as close as we can get to it, the depth of field at any selected aperture extends from infinity, from infinity to a point nearer the camera, which we consider acceptably sharp, that depth of field effect. So let's just say that this happens to be at 100 meters. So this near limit is termed the hyperfocal distance. Okay, we've now determined the hyperfocal distance for that aperture and focal length of lens. If the lens is now focused, so instead of it being focused at infinity, we now focus the lens at that determined hyperfocal distance, in which case we're going to say 100 meters in this instance. The depth of field now extends from half the hyperfocal distance, so if we say 100 meters, it now extends from 50 meters in front of the camera to infinity. Okay, so our depth of field now goes from 50 meters all the way to infinity because we've focused at 100 meters. Okay, having determined the hyperfocal distance. So the hyperfocal distance is defined as the focus distance that places the furthest edge of the depth of field at infinity. So first of all, we focused at infinity and we determined that the hyperfocal distance, the closest part that looks acceptably sharp is here at 100 meters. We focused on that. That is the hyperfocal distance. So we can go backwards and say, okay, that's now sharp. The background at infinity is also acceptably sharp. So that's where this definition comes from. The focus distance which places the furthest edge of the depth of field at infinity. So the furthest edge is now at infinity because we're focused on the hyperfocal distance. And everything this side up to a distance of half the hyperfocal distance should also be acceptably sharp. Of course, this is a subjective decision on your part. So hyperfocal distance markings, many of the modern lenses don't have this, but on the old film type we used to get these hyperfocal distance markings. So the idea was you'd set your aperture, say f16, to infinity. So we'd set that, see the infinity symbol there? We'd set that to this f16 symbol there. Okay, so we would then focus, well, by setting the infinity to that f16 pointer there, the focus is now at 5 meters. And if we look at the hyperfocal distance of f16 here, we can see that goes to about 2.5 meters. So by setting the aperture f16, the focus setting there, the infinity setting is at f16, we now have a depth of field between infinity and all the way through to 2.5 meters. And that is by focusing at 5 meters. And this is with a 50mm lens setup. 16mm, by looking at the same sort of we haven't actually got f16 here, but if we imagine it's here, we set the infinity symbol at what we'd consider the f16. That means that the lens is now focused at 0.5 meter, and the depth of field continues all the way back almost to 0.25. It is about 0.35. So that is 0.35 to infinity at f16 with this fisheye lens. We've got terrific depth of field. 28mm, that worked out about 0.7 meters to infinity. The 50mm, 2.6 meters to infinity, roughly. The 135mm goes from 20 meters to infinity. Now you might be noticing a trend here. 300mm lens, for the same depth of field, for the same aperture, f16, we only have a depth of field of 200 meters to infinity. So as the focal length increases, so the depth of field and the potential hyperfocal distance depth of field also reduces. Note that the viewfinders of all digital SLRs show the effect of the lens wide open. So when you actually change your aperture, you don't actually get a dimming effect in the viewfinder. It only stops it down when the camera shutter is activated. But most digital SLRs have what's called a stop down button, and when you press that, the lens will physically stop down to the selected aperture, and you should be able to see the depth of field effect of that, although it can be very difficult because it's so dark. However, if you've got live view on your camera, you can still apply, change the aperture and get a pretty good idea of what the depth of field is like using live view. So hopefully that has explained what hyperfocal distance is all about. And say if you've got some older lenses that you can maybe just have a play around with, you'll get a better idea as to how to set these up. But yeah, there you go. There's hyperfocal distance for you.